Thank you very much indeed, past President Clive, our Sergeant at Arms. And welcome to everybody. I will ring the bell, which is our traditional start to our luncheon meetings. I'd like to start by welcoming everybody. I have one or two notes of absentees. I particularly like to mention our absentee, our immediate past president, Tim McAndrews, who tells me he's somewhere in the air at the moment over Africa. And if he can appear for a short while, he will do so. But he is our, well, he is certainly a COVID recoverer. And so he is on his journey back to the UK, not immediately needing a vaccination, because he assures me, having had COVID, he's got 5 months of protection. But I wouldn't want to test that too much if I was Tim. So, Clive, other visitors, do we have other visitors who, firstly, those that are attending for the first time, to welcome?
Yes, with the exception of our distinguished speaker, who we will introduce a little later. I wonder, would those of you please who are visiting us for the first time, we have a lot of visitors joining us, have been with us many times before, but those for the first time, can you please unmute yourself and just introduce yourselves, please? Thank you. Now, I don't see anybody unmuting themselves. You've all been here before, have you?
Well, no one's admitting to be a first timer, no. Clive. Perhaps later on, when they see we're really quite a friendly lot, they might might admit to it.
That's okay. Anyway,
so
we do. Yeah.
Can I just introduce my friend Ryan Bircher, who is a very prominent dancer with the Royal Ballet and may be attending for his first time. Brian.
Brian, say hello, please.
Welcome, Brian.
Hello, thank you very much for the welcome. Actually, I have been to one or two other of your talks already, which I enjoyed very much. I'm very happy to be back to hear this one. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And Daniel Valchut is with us today. Daniel is a member of the club, of course, but it's the first time that he's appeared on our Zoom meeting. So welcome, Daniel. We're very pleased to see you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be back.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Clive. The next item on our routine agenda is reports from officers and committee chairs. I'm not aware of any reports. I can announce that the subcommittee, the Constitutional Review Group, is now preparing a report for council, and the findings of that group are in progress for the annual general meeting. I'd inquire whether there's anybody from C&V committee if there's anybody who would like to make any announcements.
I didn't see anybody.
I know that they have a committee meeting coming up, but I'm not quite sure what has been finally agreed. Then we have, I have had a report from our treasurer, which also concerns C&V, in that the Burns lunch we had last week has raised £1,000, which I'm sure the C&V members will be very pleased to hear, and that's going to the Imperial Charitable Trust to help with the, as we have in the past, with supporting the staff at the Imperial Group at this time of difficulty. I'd also like to mention an activity of our honorary member, Dame Esther Ranson. She is speaking tomorrow night on Lifeline for Lockdown, and the information will be put on the chat by Eve Conway, but I would encourage you to actually join that meeting. We know that there is a lot of depression and is an issue at the moment with individuals who are isolated. And Lifeline is doing its very best to actually help with that. And it would be good to hear what Dame Esther has to say on the subject. So Eve, if you would kindly put the link onto chat. I'm sure it's available from other places as well. I'd inquire whether we have any particular visits from other clubs. I know that Robert will have visited Redbridge. Any international visits that people would like to mention?
Anthony Newton.
No, thank you. Oh, Anthony. Unmute, please, Anthony. Anthony, unmute, please.
Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, we had the incoming president of the Wiesbaden Club who spoke to us with a couple of others. And he invited me back to Zoom at his club, which I did last week. I had a meeting with about 47 people, extremely informal, very casual, very good. It brings and sends regards and best wishes from Wiesbaden to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony.
And President, can I just add, it's Eve here. Robert and I both went to the Rotary Club of Madras for the Rotary International President nominee, the first woman president of Rotary International, Jennifer Jones, and that was excellent. She was amazing, wasn't she?
Yes.
And there were about
700.
it was about 700 actually altogether people on that Zoom meeting. So that's Rotary Club of Madras, which is Chennai. And also I will put the details about the amazing Dame Esther Ranson in the chat box, and she is really fantastic for Rotary Together talks tomorrow.
Thank you, Eve, via Robert, and we appreciate those comments. I know that the Vice President, I think, is it Vice President her title, has been drawing crowds wherever she's appeared, and I think we've had previous opportunities. I'm only waiting for one of our speaker groups to actually get her to join us for a meeting. Perhaps before too long. Thank you. Birthdays, we have none present, I think, who have a birthday in the coming week. So we're all allowed to stay the same age as we are at the moment, which I'm grateful for. And then I'd like to move rapidly on towards the main event of the day. But before that, to ask you, as is our tradition, to offer a toast to the Queen. So if you have a vessel to hand, please gather it and join me in the toast to the Queen. Always a bit strange for doing that silently, but we found that by the time people have unmuted and remuted, we tend to lose touch with what's going on. So without more ado, and slightly out of our normal process, I'm now going to invite Nadine Berta, who is of the Rotary Club of Harrow. Sorry?
Nahid.
Nahid Berta of the Rotary Club of Harrow, who has, for example, at the Christmas auction, bought pearls for us to auction, is now bringing us pearls of wisdom. But I will ask Nahid if actually she would be good enough to introduce our speaker. Nahid, over to you.
Good afternoon, President David, fellow Rotarians and friends of Rotary. You have welcomed me during the lockdown to attend many of your Zoom meetings, so I was able to enjoy the great choice of excellent speakers. And today is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Sir Vince Cable. I have known Vince for many years. First time I invited him in 1997 to speak with other politicians in a debate when I was a chair of politics at university. Since then, he has spoken to other organizations which I was involved, including Rotary Club of Harrow. Sir Vince was Secretary of State in the coalition for 5 years, business, innovation, and skills. Leader of the Liberal Democrat, MP for Twickenham for 20 years. Before that, chief economist at Shell. And he was also lecturer of economics at the University of Glasgow. He has written several books, including bestsellers about the financial crisis, The Storm, and the novel Open Arms. His latest book, Money and Power, will shortly be released. Currently, Vince is visiting professor at LSE, and he's a columnist for the Independent newspaper. Vince, we are very much looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Well, Nahid and friends, thank you for inviting me to join you. As Nahid suggested, I have known the Rotary for some years. I'm a frequent guest with the Twickenham and Richmond branches, and I think I'm an honorary member there. And I've got to know others, including Nairobi, where my brother-in-law was president, and got me involved in some of their charitable activities. So it's good to be with you. The suggestion was that it might be helpful to try and put this whole COVID issue in context, because it's, I suspect most of us are rather bored to the back teeth with the issue. It consumes most of the news bulletins every time we turn on the television and the radio, and it dominates everything. At least before Christmas, we had the American election and Brexit, and now we've pretty much just got vaccination and the continuing saga of COVID to keep us occupied. But very often, I think, we lose sight of the big picture, putting this in terms of geography and history, and the impact it's having on the economy, ours and other people's. And I thought I would talk to you for a while about that bigger picture, and we could get a discussion going on from that. I think the first thing to say, and we tend to forget this, I think, particularly with this COVID nationalism that's been creeping in the last few days in Europe, that this is a global issue. I mean, this is not Britain. This is global. I was reading the other day that in a country we used to call Swaziland, I think it's got a new name now, you know, the Prime Minister and a member of the cabinet had just died. If you log into what's happening in India, you know, there are literally millions of people queuing up for vaccines. I mean, this is a drama that's happening, you know, everywhere, not just in Britain. And we're at different stages of the epidemic, and different countries are affected differently. And countries like Brazil, Mexico have been terribly, terribly badly affected. Others have somehow bounced off and have either controlled it or been lucky. But it is a global issue. I think, secondly, it's useful, I think, to look at history. There have been global pandemics before. You know, there will be global pandemics in future. You know, if you go back to the medieval era, of course, we had the Great Plague, but that was a totally different order of magnitude. I mean, about 1/3 of the population died in England, as it then was, in a succession of outbreaks. It had, you know, it was a catastrophe. This time, you know, we think it's pretty awful, and indeed, we've had over 100,000 people in the UK died who wouldn't otherwise have died. Which is pretty shocking for the families concerned. But that is 1/3, under 1/3 of 1%, as opposed to 1/3 of the total. So this is a magnitude of 100 less than the Great Plague. The only thing that we have any real comparison with is the Spanish flu after the First World War, that's estimated to have killed maybe 25-50 million people across the world. And as far as the UK is concerned, it was probably about twice as bad as the current pandemic. And most of the people who sadly died were young people, actually. People who had been exhausted and had lost their immunity as a result of the struggles of the First World War and the poverty that came at that time. But that's the only thing that we have any real comparison with, and there have been studies done about how various places dealt with it better than others. And it was partly that experience and the history of the Spanish flu which led to the lockdowns and the techniques that have been employed to try and control the epidemic now. But I thought I would talk more about the economic side, how it's affected the economy. I am an economist, and I'm interested in that aspect. And it affects all of us ultimately because it affects our living standards. I mean, essentially, again, to put this in context, for most of the post-war era, and certainly my generation, you know, in my mid-70s, living standards have grown pretty solidly, pretty much every year. You know, 2 to 3%, good years, bad years. But you know, living standards were slowly creeping up every year. That's how it happened in this country. It was quite gradual, about 2%, 2.5% a year. In America, most parts of Europe, like Germany, a bit faster. But we're in that sort of order of magnitude. In China, Korea, South Korea, and for a couple of decades in India, something like 8 to 10%. Living standards were doubling every 7 or 8 years. But that's something we were used to. You know, economic growth, expansion, living standards going up more or less rapidly in different parts of the world. Well, this story was shaken back in 2010 when we had the banking crisis. And in the UK, our economy fell by about 5% as a result of the banking crisis and what happened after. And it's taken best part of the last decade actually to get back to where we were. And some people are actually worse off than they were at that time, a decade ago. So other people done very well. But we pretty much caught up with the loss that we experienced at that time. But to make a comparison, this current crisis has been twice as bad as the financial crisis in economic terms. The British economy fell by about 10% from the beginning of 2020 to roughly where we are now. And again, to put that in a wider context, it is pretty terrible in terms of our own experience. But if you look at recent historical events, probably not so catastrophic. In the United States, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, their economy fell by about 30%. It was 3 times as bad as we've experienced in the crash since the pandemic. The breakup of the Soviet Union was another catastrophic economic event, and the impact on countries like Poland, and which went through a decline, temporary decline of that kind of order of magnitude. So I hope that sort of puts it in context. Our economy has fallen by 10%. I think what most people want to know is, when are we going to recover? And it's going to be easier to recover than it was from the financial crisis, because after the financial crisis, banks were not lending. I mean, I was the government minister and trying to bully them into lend more to get the economy going again. But so that's not a problem this time. Once the lockdown is lifted, there is absolutely no reason why, shops, cafes, restaurants, travel up to a point, all these things should spring back to normal, and so we'll get a recovery. It'll be a funny shaped recovery, a bit like a W. People were talking a year ago about having a V. You go down and then bounce up again. So that's not going to happen. It's a bit more like a W. But we will get later this year, over the summer and the autumn, a very rapid bounce back in terms of the economy. And that's partly because the restrictions are lifted, partly because a lot of older people like me have stored up a lot of savings in the pandemic. We haven't been able to spend, and people are going to go out and spend. There was a period in the 1920s, it was called the Roaring Twenties. I don't think anybody on this call was around at the time when this happened, after the last pandemic, and after the First World War. People just went mad. I mean, they spent as if there was no tomorrow, and they had a wild time. And later this year, we may see some of that kind of spirit going back, because a lot of people have accumulated savings. Some people, of course, are terribly poor and in a very bad position. But for those older people, particularly who are well off, there's going to be a spending spree. And in addition, this growth, this recovery, is going to get a lot of encouragement from what's happening in other parts of the world. If you're following what's happening in the United States and President-elect, President Biden, he's just put before a Congress an enormous spending package. We're not talking billions anymore, we're talking trillions of dollars that are going to be spent. They're going to send checks to every household to spend money. People who've been unemployed are going to get financial help. There's going to be a massive spending program on improving American infrastructure, improving health provision. Now, the Congress is not going to allow Biden to spend as much as he wants to, but there will be a big spending spree, and a lot of it will be communicated to the rest of the world. The same thing is happening in China. China is the only country in the world of any significance that actually managed to grow last year. You know, the Chinese economy is certainly in recent decades been far outgrowing the rest of the world, and the same is happening now. They got their pandemic under control. You can argue about what they did at the beginning was pretty bad, but once they'd identified the problem, they stopped it. There is a minimal amount of COVID now in China. Their economy is growing. People are out shopping, going to sports events, and the economy is growing rapidly. And of course, that's sucking in a lot of demand for products from the rest of the world. And the combination of what's happening in America and China are pulling up the rest of the world. And those of you who follow financial events will have noticed that things like metal prices, oil prices, indicators of the use of freighters in international trade, all of these things are now beginning to boom. Potentially could boom out of control, but they're booming. So we are getting a recovery taking place. But in the UK, there are going to be limitations. And, you know, I think we need to be realistic about what these are. First of all, high streets, as you know, have been absolutely hammered. So when we start going back into the town centres for shopping, we'll discover that there are lots of shops that have closed and they're not going to reopen. And probably for years to come, they're going to be boarded up. And in the more prosperous parts of the country, most parts of London, this is something we can live with. But if you live in Oldham or Hartlepool or Workington, depressed communities, they're going to have desolate town centres, which will, discourage commercial activity. And this is going to be a big challenge for the next few years. Similarly, travel, because we're not completely free until the whole world is free of this pandemic. It's going to be difficult to travel to many countries. We're going to be very restricted in where we can go, and I suspect most of us are going to be taking our buckets and spades to Blackpool or Skegness or something this year rather than to the Mediterranean. And as a result of that, some of those industries that have been badly hit, like the airlines, travel agents. I had a communication yesterday from the Independent Travel Agents Association, about 300,000 people. And they see no prospect of continuing. Many of their firms are closing down. So there are sectors of the economy which are going to be really, really struggling. And although the bounce back that we're going to see, we'll see many people getting their jobs back in pubs and restaurants and service activities. There are a lot of people who have skills that they've lost and their firms are not going to restart again. And just remember that the furlough scheme is keeping a lot of people going, and that's due to end at the end of April. And the firms that are just not viable are just going to go under. So there is going to be, alongside this recovery, and as I say, probably a boom and the roaring 20s, we are going to get bits of the economy that are really going to struggle and continuing hardship. I think we also need to be realistic about the fact that there are long-term problems. This is not just a one-off. We may find that we're already finding that there are new variants of the disease coming in. So some countries will find themselves cut off. We may find problems in this country as there's new variants coming in, which will be very difficult to cope with. Some, banks and financial institutions have been keeping firms going with loans. They're heavily loaded with bad debts. Some of those financial institutions are going to go under. There is a risk. It's not massive, I think, but there is a risk of a new financial crisis when this starts to unravel. And to my mind, the most serious of all, of course, a lot of young people, children and youngsters generally, have lost a year's education. And I heard from Nairobi that in some of the slum areas, they've just closed the school. They've lost a year. Kids have lost the ability to read and write that they were acquiring. And in our own country, university students, sixth formers have been set back for months in terms of their skill development. And of course, this imposes an economic cost. And you've seen the report of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which quantified all of that. And the final point I will make, and this is where, until recently, a politician, a kind of problem that I grappled with when I was a minister, and is going to come back with vengeance, which is what we do about government deficits and debt. Because the government, rightly so, it's not a criticism, it's absolutely right thing to do, has kept spending to try and keep the economy afloat. Its tax revenues have fallen because a lot of businesses have closed. So we've opened up an enormous deficit in the government's budget. And as a result, the amount of government debt in relation to the economy has really shot up. Now, is this a problem or isn't it? Well, a reassuring thought, which is basically where I am, I think, is that we have far less of a problem than we did after the Second World War. The level of debt in relation to the economy was twice as big after the Second World War than it is now. Sorry, that was my home telephone going. And what happened after the war was that we had steady growth, and we had inflation, and gradually these things wiped out the level of debt that we'd accumulated over a 30-40 year period. And we got to a position 10 years ago where debt was at a much, much lower level than it had been after the war. And if we took a similar long-term view, we wouldn't panic, and we'd gradually allow the level of government debt to go down as our economies recover. And in addition, of course, interest rates, the interest rate the government pays are very low. They're virtually zero. And what's happened is that central banks like the Bank of England are buying up vast quantities of government debt, and in this way keeping the costs down. And that's fine. And I'm one of those people who doesn't think that we should be rushing into cutting spending or raising taxes. It's got to be done very slowly and gradually. But there are some people who are panicking. I think they're in the Treasury. There are some people who say, well, it can't go on like this. We're going to get back to inflation, and therefore interest rates will have to go up, and that will increase the problems of debt. That is the big debate now going on amongst economists and in government. How quickly should government start to get the public finances back into balance? As I said, my instincts are that we take this very gradually. We don't panic. But Mr. Sunak, I get the impression that his officials are telling him that he's got to slam on the brakes, which is going to make the recovery less pleasant than it otherwise would be. But there's a lot of good things to report. we are we're not too far now from a phase of recovery, and those of you who've got lots of money in the bank will be able to run out and spend it. But I've given a warning, I think, about some of the problems that are going to stay with us, some of them for a long time. It's a mixed picture, and those of us who are by nature optimists will see the light at the end of the tunnel, and those who are by nature pessimists will see the light as a train coming in the opposite direction. Anyway, let me leave it there, and you can ask me questions about what I've said. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Vince. I know that there were more questions than answers in these circumstances, and I know I myself could raise many questions, but one of the things the club has been good at in the past is asking questions. And I'll ask if our Sergeant at Arms, Clive, would actually act superintendent for the questioners and direct the questioners and their questions towards Sir Vince Cable. Clive, over to you.
Thank you, President David. If you have a question for Sir Vince, would you please unmute yourself? You will then come up on my screen here on the right-hand side here, and I'll be able to call you. So, Eve, I see you are there. Would you like to?
Hi there. Thanks very much, Clive, and thanks very much, Sir Vince. That was excellent. We're talking about the financial impact, economic impact of the of COVID. But don't you, I mean, we're seeing a lot of inequality currently with the way the pandemic is hitting certain of our communities. And a lot of this is being put down to, the fact that they're in poverty, basically, a lot of these communities, and they're economically disadvantaged. So it was really to ask your view, is the pandemic exposing the inequalities financially, economically, in England and in the UK, do you think?
Well, the simple answer is yes, and in a rather brutal way. And it's partly an issue between generations, because, as we all know, this has been done to protect essentially older people who are more vulnerable, whereas it's younger people who are paying the price in terms of lost jobs and lost incomes. But there is also apart from the young versus old, there is also a rich versus poor issue, which is very acute. I mean, the part of the problem is if you live in a relatively poor part of the country. Can you just hold on a minute? I've got a bit of background. Rachel, could you please quiet? Sorry. In some parts of the country, there are a lot of people who, have to go out to work to survive, and so they instead of doing social isolation, they're going out to work, picking up infection, bringing it back home to their neighbours and relatives. There are a lot of people who are forced by circumstances to live in very cramped accommodation, where badly ventilated property, where infections are easily spread, which is probably why some ethnic communities have been differentially affected by all this. I mean, you can alleviate this to some extent by improving the benefits to in-work people, and something has been done, but nonetheless, the universal credit is still very low. There are all these kind of handicaps to people who want to take advantage of it, the long wait that you have to go through before the credit kicks in. It's very difficult to get sickness benefit if you're on low income because you haven't built up the qualifications. So a lot of people are really suffering, and they're getting behind with their rent, and then they're faced with eviction. The evictions have been theoretically stopped, but a lot of landlords are just waiting to throw people out who've got behind with their rent. So yeah, there's a lot of suffering, and of course we're a rich country. Of course, in poorer countries, these problems are much more extreme and much more acute. So the answer to your question is yes.
Thank you. Brian Summers and then Doug Wills.
Thank you very much, Clive. We are on there, aren't we? Yes. I'd like to ask you regarding the origins of COVID-19. A lot of people, including myself, believe that a certain government hid this, locked up their doctors for daring to suggest that they'd started this sort of thing, and then dear old ex-President Trump has called it the Chinese virus. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, I actually don't think it's helpful to sort of blame people for it. I mean, it's certainly the case that the Chinese behaved very badly for 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning. We don't know if it was the leadership. It may well have just been people in that province of Hebei who didn't want to get into trouble, so they hid the facts and prevented people at the center knowing about it. It could have been the leadership, and they tried to cover it up, as you suggest, and that meant that the thing had spread further than it should have done. But actually, you know, so many countries in the world have not acted as quickly as they should have done. I mean, you know, our country also, actually, and the Americans too. Some were very prompt, and the countries that have done well, you know, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Germany and the UK and Europe, are the other countries that acted very quickly and very promptly. But I think simply to, you know, label this as the Chinese disease isn't helpful. And as I say, the Chinese dealt with it badly initially, but subsequently they dealt with it with brutal efficiency, and that's why, you know, China is now growing.
Doug.
Yes, it's fascinating hearing from you, because you certainly have the political and economic background far greater than we have. Today, the Mayor of London has said that London will need a post-war-like renaissance and investment, because it has been so devastated by the economics. He's talked about London losing 250,000 jobs last year already. Do you think it is of that scale? And do you see Boris acknowledging that and being able to react on that scale? Is it really that phenomenal?
Well, it is very, very serious. I mean, actually, I think London will recover quicker than many other parts of the country, because the economy is so diverse, and the kind of things which, you know, dominate the London economy, which are the sort of services, you know, nighttime, creative industries. I mean, these are things that will bounce back. It will be much more difficult in some of the depressed communities of the Midlands and the North, because they don't have the purchasing power. I mean, the one area of London that is potentially very seriously hit, of course, is you know, the banking centres in the East End Docklands, because first of all, it's going to be quite difficult to reopen many of those places, because, as you know, they're serviced by lifts. And therefore, as long as there's social distancing, they're quite difficult to use. They're also, because these big banks and insurance companies and so on are very efficient, they've got used to distance communication, you know, using the internet, doing Zoom. And so, you know, when they get back to normal, they're only going to need half their staff. And all the sandwich bars and cafes around them are not going to have the clientele. So that sector, the financial sector in the center of the city, and the service industries which are around it, will, I fear, be quite badly hit.
Yeah. Thank you. Margaret Cooper.
Yes, thank you, Clive. My question is, it is very obvious that existing systems of governments obviously couldn't really cope with the effect of the pandemic. But my interest is any proposed solutions of the future of these existing governments. How can they're taking the interests of low income countries and war-afflicted areas in the world. How can they use their resources to bring them in and do something about this global existing poverty?
Well, it's an important question because the news we get is almost entirely about Britain and Europe. We really don't hear very much about what's happening in Africa or the Indian subcontinent, where most of the world's poor people are. And they're suffering, and they're suffering partly because of the disease, but more because of the economic impact. Certainly countries like Kenya and Uganda, which I've been looking at, the costs of the lockdown are far bigger than the costs of the pandemic itself. Not too many people have died because it's a relatively young population with a lot of resistance, but they've suffered terrible economic damage. You know, their tourist industry has disappeared. Game parks in Kenya, for example, have lost all their customers. So as a result, people have been laid off. You know, the animals have been slaughtered by poachers. Permanent damage is being done to the country. So India is another good example. India was doing extremely well, actually, as a country. They were growing almost as fast as China, or in some years faster, for about 20 years. But the last year has been absolutely terrible. They had a lockdown that was very badly timed, and it meant that hundreds of thousands of migrant workers were just left destitute. And then they fled back to the villages, taking the infection with them. And it's done terrible damage to the Indian economy, which has been one of the worst affected in the world. And of course, most of that's not been reported here. So we've got this problem of many parts of Asia and Africa suffering terrible damage. They're going to need help, writing off debt obligations, for example. Some of that's happened, but not very much. And they're also going to need help with the vaccine because they can't afford to buy it. That's why actually the AstraZeneca project is so much more generous than the Pfizer project, which of course Pfizer was a purely commercial vaccine, whereas AstraZeneca has been done on a non-profit basis, and they've safeguarded, tens of millions of vaccines, which they're going to send to other countries as part of what's called COVAX, which is a kind of global obligation to supply countries that can't otherwise afford it. So your question is a very important one. And I think it is important that we don't become totally parochial and get into a kind of vaccine nationalist mindset, because there are lots of people who can't afford the vaccine, and they're going to have help to solve that problem.
Thank you. President David, you said you had several questions. I wonder if I could invite you to put a question.
Well, yes. I mean, it's such a broad-ranging subject, but first I'd just to make an observation in terms of source of the epidemic or the pandemic. I understand that the Spanish flu came out from a duck in America. And it's never been called, the American flu, but of course its consequences were very wide-ranging. I'd also wondered who are the beneficiaries. The Chinese, they were the first to identify and suffer the disruption to their economy. But my feeling is that when we start spending our money again in vast quantities, all our savings to recover, a lot of that will go to China. And they will actually be a beneficiary from our recovery. But my main question is over timing. If you follow the if you follow the approach you think the Treasury will take of tax and cut, the impact on inflation compared to a long-term recovery plan, keep spending a little bit, keep taxing a little bit, and so on. The impact of inflation on debt and whether or not it's actually a bad thing to actually have inflation, because if that cuts debt as it did in the 70s, and many of those on the screen probably benefited by house prices going up, protected because while their mortgages went down. Could you comment on the time you think it will actually take, and the impact of the macro forces on the UK, the UK's outcome?
Well, the question about whether there will or won't be inflation and when it kicks in and how much it is, that's sort of much debated by people in the markets. And those of you who follow the pink press and the financial sections of newspapers will have seen this is a very, very live debate. And to be frank, nobody has a definitive answer. I think that, my view about it is that we've become a little bit obsessed by inflation because of the experiences of the 1970s. Of course, it was then brought to a halt, and we thought that this was a sort of problem that had just gone away. And as a result, the European Union in particular, with its very strict anti-inflation objectives, largely imposed by the German Bundesbank, has been too conservative in economic terms, and it's acted as a sort of brake on growth. The Americans have been much more flexible, actually, and they're indicating that they're not going to react if inflation goes above 2%, which is their target. So it may get up to 3-4%, 5% before the American Federal Reserve does anything about it. And I think that's the correct response, and I think that's actually what the Bank of England should be doing, rather than the European model, which is much more anti-inflationary. I think the other point which links to the last part of your question is that there's a difference between inflation in goods, what we experience when we go shopping, and inflation of assets, in other words, houses, shares. And what's been happening in recent years is that we've had virtually no inflation in the things where we have shopping, under 2% at the moment a year, but we've had rampant inflation in house prices, which is doing terrible damage. I mean, if you're sitting in a house and the price is going up, you probably feel rather cocky, but actually it's doing terrible damage to society, because it means that middle and low income families can't even begin to think about home ownership. It's just completely out of the question. So you have hundreds of thousands, millions of young families living in rented accommodation, very insecure, having to move houses frequently, and it's blighting a whole generation. So under occupation is being, suffering terribly as a result of the inflation of asset prices. And what we do know is that all the things that the Bank of England and the American Federal Reserve have been doing to keep economies alive during this crisis and the financial crisis have pumped money through the banks into housing. And that's puffed up the price. So we have two different kinds of inflation. One which is real and happening now and is doing terrible damage, and another which is the inflation we experience in day-to-day shopping, which has been very, very subdued. We need to make a clear distinction between those two. It's quite difficult to solve one problem but not the other.
Thank you. Vasi Daniel, Anthony Newton, and then Mark Zudini. Vasi.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you very much, Sir Vince, for your informative, interesting talk. My question is, I was reading about this new vaccine called Novavax. What do you think of that? I mean, the trials have been taking place in South Africa, and they said it may not have a great effect on a second booster. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not a medical expert, so I don't want to give advice on things I've absolutely no qualification whatever to talk about. I think the one thing I would say is that we do need to make sure that these vaccines are properly tested. I mean, the first vaccine vaccine that came out was the Sputnik in Russia, which may be brilliant for all I know, but we know it wasn't properly tested. And the vaccine that is coming out in the greatest volumes is the Chinese vaccine, Sinovac, which has been used in the Arabian Gulf, the United Emirates and others. And it seems to work, and it's cheap and widely available, but they haven't revealed it goes back to an earlier question about where the Chinese operate. All the details are not fully out there, and so there's a lack of trust about it. I really don't know about the vaccine you've referred to, but I think what we do need to insist on before we use it is that they go through each of the stages of the trials, so that we've really evaluated it properly. Even the ones we're using, like Pfizer and AstraZeneca, we really don't know. We think it's going to protect us, those of us who've had it, but we really don't know whether it stops transmission from one person to another, and you can only find that out by proper experiments. So there has to be real, scientific testing of new vaccines.
Thank you.
And Anthony.
Thank you very much, Sir Vince. As a lifelong Asquithian Liberal, I'd like to say also to start how much I admire your political stance almost as much as your dancing, liberal dancing. But just to make a serious point, don't you think that we need a far bigger, something like a national strategic plan to cover England and the UK, not just covering business, but all the other aspects that, for example, the first question asked other people, not just the money side of it, but broad aspects of where we're going and what we're doing things for generally. Thank you.
Yes, I think there's a lot of sense behind that. We've got some very, very deep issues. All the inequalities we talked about, inequalities between one part of the country and the other. We have this big environmental challenge of the climate, which is going to require an enormous amount of investment and reorientation of priorities. And ideally, you do that within the framework of a sort of long-term national plan. These things are quite difficult to put in place when you have a politics where people are, divided, which is the way our system works. I'm not saying it's a bad system, that's democracy. Governments change, they have different priorities, and it's quite difficult to have that long-term planning. One of the things I tried to do when I was Secretary of State was bring in an industrial strategy, as we called it, lasting for, it did last for about 5 years, but then my successor lost interest and, it wasn't sustained. And if you're a business person and you're wanting to plan investment over 10, 15, 20 years, it's quite difficult to do it when the government's constantly changing and exerting sort of different priorities. So I agree with you. I think my experience as government has made me a bit sort of pessimistic about the opportunities to do it. For countries that don't have constantly changing governments, like China, for obvious reasons, or Singapore, which is more democratic, then it's easier to have this kind of long-term planning framework.
Yeah, Mark, and then Noam. Mark Zadini, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, there we go. Hi. My question follows up a little bit from the last question. I work from home, so nothing has much changed for me. But what has changed dramatically is when I drive around London, the traffic is great. I like it very much these days, not only because the schools are closed, but probably also because many less people are around. And suddenly London becomes quite a pleasant place to be. So it's a side effect of the pandemic, maybe, and I think it's a positive effect, and I hope this continues somehow. And the other one is, I live in Gladstone Park area, and I have a view over London. I can see the Shard now much more clearly than before. And again, this is a effect of the less pollution. So I think this is great, and living the number of deaths, people dying, the vaccine aside, which I don't want to get into. And in fact, I stopped reading newspaper for my own mental health. I just want to ask you if something is happening, or if the politicians are really taking into this into account, and maybe like the previous question was noting, are they going to tackle these climate issues, these environmental issues into some sort of laws? And do you think this the economy following this pandemic will change in a way towards the environment, because I think if this pandemic didn't happen, I think maybe I feel that we reach a point of saturation. I think everybody, everything was pushed to the extremes in terms of economy, spending, consumerism and so on. So I guess, is there going to be a dramatic changing point in the way we live and we spend and the economy is run, do you think, or everything will be back to where we were before?
Yes, well, the phenomenon of a quiet London and a less polluted London, it is, superficially pleasant, but it's partly because fewer people are working, and also a lot of people are kind of fleeing the capital. I mean, the population is declining now for the first time for many years. A lot of people have gone back to Eastern Europe. A lot of local people have gone off and bought houses in Cornwall or whatever. So it's now a shrinking city as well as a quieter one. And of course, one of the things that has happened is that there's been a complete collapse in the use of public transport, which is important for the pandemic, but it's not good news for the long-term environmental health of the capital, that we do need people back on buses and trains. But in terms of the wider challenge, I think we do need to remember Britain is 2% of the world economy, 2%, 1% of the world's population, 2% of the world economy. What we do is important to us, and important that it has to be seen more widely. And at the moment, you have some countries, notably in Europe, which are very committed to meeting climate objectives. The Chinese, who are the largest emitters, say they're committed, and they seem to be doing some good things. The Americans, despite Biden's personal commitment, are not, as a country, committed to do anything, and there's strong resistance to action. But we'll see what happens at this conference in Glasgow, which is due later this year, and is supposed to, orientate the world to a much more climate-friendly trajectory. If I just speak personally, one of the things I've taken on in my retirement, I sat on the board of a new company that's just come up, loading vehicles with hydrogen as a new fuel, which is, and it may be that in a few years' time, when you go to a petrol station, you'll be loading up, well, certainly if you're a lorry or a bus, you'll be loading up with hydrogen rather than diesel. And, my company succeeds, it will.
Thank you. Noam.
Vince, thank you very much. I would like to ask you a question wearing your economist hat. I'm an entrepreneur and already took some advantage as a turnaround. And I think that we have in the UK and in the world immense opportunity to use this highly volume of printed money to invest in where we are lacking. And I'll give you an example. We have a problem called Brexit, where European nationalities, nurses, and healthcare professionals are leaving the UK, and it's an opportunity for us to train more people. But there are many, many other opportunities. How do you see it, and how would you go about it?
Well, I was responsible for training. That was what the skills bit of biz was. And it's absolutely critical. I mean, whether Britain succeeds as a country or not in future years will depend very much on how seriously we take training. But it's not an easy thing to move in a hurry. I mean, one of the things I tried to get going was large-scale launch of apprenticeships, and we did have a big boost, particularly kind of high-level apprenticeships, degree equivalent. But it sort of got stuck. You know, the government then tries to raise money to boost it by putting a levy on companies, and that stopped the training. You have to have agreed national standards of skill, and that takes a long time to get employers on board and constantly to update them. And that's where the previous question I was asked about a long-term national recovery plan. I mean, this is an area where you do need consistency over years and decades. I mean, one area where we should now be putting a lot of money is adult education, because there's a lot of people in their middle years and early retired who could be very productive and, you know, could start companies as you're doing. But you know, they need help in terms of, you know, learning a language, learning computer skills, you know, hundreds of things. And adult education, the kind of things you get in London through the City Lit, you know, are a very good manifestation of that. But they've been struggling for years with lack of funding. And if we're really serious about training, that's where we should be directing quite a lot of effort.
Thank you. Tim Moore, I believe you had a question. Tim, do you have a question? Okay, Rima Tantash.
Can I?
Oh, here's Tim. Who's that?
So Vince, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm speaking from Brussels, where everything that we get is criticism of the UK about Brexit. But you didn't mention Brexit and the challenge that presents. But also what worries me more than anything is the breakup of the United Kingdom. That must have an effect on the economic position if we get to that stage. Do you believe in that?
Well, I didn't talk about Brexit because I've been talking about it for 5 years. I was one of the leaders of the Remain group, but it's now happened. We just, you know, that is a fact of life, and we're going to have to adjust to life in a different environment. There's no point just going back over history. And of course, the breakup of the UK is something we can prevent. And those of you who follow The Independent will have seen that I was writing about this last week. It's not going to be straightforward because there is clearly a big shift of mood in Scotland. A lot of people who were not initially keen on independence, happy with the UK, but they now feel after Brexit that a decision has been made to change their identity in a way that they reject. And so the supporters of independence have gone up from about 45% to 60%. I mean, the counter arguments to Brexit, to Scottish independence, are largely sort of practical economic issues, whereas the arguments in favour of independence are emotional and issues around identity. And it's difficult to have a debate between emotional identity arguments and hard-headed cash arguments. But the practical argument is very serious that, you know, clearly Brexit is pretty disruptive. Breaking up the UK would be much more disruptive, and it would affect people's living standards in Scotland and everywhere else and cause an enormous amount of damage. Now, whether people choose to see it that way or they continue to feel very alienated from London government, ultimately is down to them. I lived in Scotland for some years, and I actually competed against Scottish nationalists at a time when they were a sort of cranky little sect and thinking about blowing up telephone pylons and things. But now they're a very serious force, and they're very well organized. Although there are criticism of the Scottish government, they're reasonably efficient and certainly moderate. And my own assessment is actually that the bandwagon of independence will be very difficult to stop.
Rima.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the lecture. I have two questions. This pandemic has forced us all to get a new set of behaviors and values, to be honest, are setting our priorities right. Are we going to turn into a consumer sort of kind of a society where we're changing our the way that we deal with business? We like if you look about shopping, for example, now people are turning into online one. So are going to many of these shops close, or where exactly are we heading with regard to the not on the retail industry, about the human behavior with regard to essential living in this society and in the whole world, in fact. The second question is that these days, of course, people have visited the way they work. So many people are turning into working from home, and accordingly, they're changing their location accordingly, so they can work from far. They don't really need to be in the city. And as we've seen, the issue of the initiative of the government of helping people to buy new property here, they dropped the price for the government, the duty, the stamp, the tax, the stamp duty that you have to pay when you buy, had encouraged some people. But however, where exactly are we going with the real estate market for buying apartments, new purchased apartments, the new builds that have been going on in Nine Elms, in Battersea, in Wandsworth, all these places? So where the prices are going? Are they going to drop? Are they going to go? Where are we? Thank you so much.
Well, you certainly seem in a rather beautiful place. I don't know whether that's where you are at the moment, but your picture suggests a very enviable location. In terms of consumption, I think in the short run, it is very important that we consume, because one person's consumption is another person's job. But I think what you may be hinting at in your question is that there are sort of deeper values at stake. And we are seeing quite a lot of evidence of, genuine community mindedness, people helping their neighbors, helping elderly people. And, I would hope that when we come out of that kind of sense of social solidarity, which has been much stronger in some other countries, Japan, probably more than anywhere else, which didn't have compulsory lockdowns. They relied very heavily on people's sense of social responsibility and their respect for fellow citizens. I mean, that kind of spirit, I would hope we get more of here. In terms of the real estate market, I think not just now, but for many years, the policies of successive governments have been completely mad. It's been giving inducements to people to buy, and therefore pumping up demand when the supply is inadequate. And all that's happened is that you've got higher and higher prices, making property more and less affordable. Completely insane policies. I got into trouble in government when I was constantly quabbling with Mr. Osborne about the so-called help to buy policy, which it helped a few individuals, but made it more difficult for everybody else. So I don't favor giving financial inducements to an occupation. It simply makes the problem worse. We need improved supply of the kind and in a place where people want it. And what the immediate need really is for low rented accommodation and cheap housing in parts of the country where people want to live. And you can only do that through local councils and housing associations, and they've been starved of capital. So we need a big change in the way housing policy is conducted. And it isn't achieved by giving financial inducements to buy.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. Are there any more last questions, please?
Hugh.
Hugh, do you wish to say something?
Can I ask a question, Clive?
No, Hugh and then Rajiv.
Yeah.
Sylvain, you may remember coming to speak to us when we met at the Arts Club in Dover Street quite some years ago. But my question is, if I can put it briefly, you mentioned about the high expenditure plan of Biden. Obviously, if he gets away with this, he's going to reverse Trump's tax policies. In a word, how do you see his policies affecting the American stock market?
Well, the American stock market is a rather strange phenomenon at the moment, because some stocks, as I'm sure you know, you sound as if you participate.
Yes.
And some stocks have done absolutely extraordinarily well. Mainly the big online companies, and Elon Musk's company, I think, is now worth more than all of the other car companies in the world of any substance. It's ridiculous because they hardly produce any, and it reflects the kind of incredible distortion. So the thing about the American stock market is that it's distorted. That I think the real value of stocks in general has not been increasing. But there's this handful of high-tech companies whose values have become almost ridiculous. So I would think that this boom in asset prices is likely to continue for some time, because the American Federal Reserve is keen to keep pumping money in. They're not going to take away the punch bowl from the party anytime soon. And of course, Biden's fiscal policy is going to stimulate it further. So I'd have thought that we're not heading for a crash, but I would be very surprised if some of the massively highly valued companies don't see some sort of correction in the near future.
Thank you. And the final question, Rajiv.
Yeah, thank you, Sir Vince. I enjoyed your talk. My question to you today is that if you were Mr. Sunak, how would you pay this huge, tremendous borrowing back?
Well, I think the first thing to do, when we're a little bit clearer, probably in April, when he's going to give a supplementary budget, I think is actually to set out a medium long-term plan. I mean, I think that's, rather than rushing into things, is to have and there are two steps to it. I think the first is that we've got to get to a position where the budget is reasonably balanced on current spending. In other words, government should continue to borrow to invest. I mean, we've got a very bad infrastructure in this country, and we need to invest in it on a long-term basis. But in terms of our so-called current budget, then that needs to come back into balance reasonably soon, over a 2 to 3 year period. But then the question of the outstanding stock of debt that's been accumulated in this crisis, I would just leave it alone and gradually let it work down over time. There's absolutely no reason why the government should be committed to paying down the level of debt that's accumulated. So I would, to answer the question, I'd first of all set out a medium-term plan, the fiscal policy for getting the country back into balance, and then be reasonably relaxed about the time frame. I think it probably will be necessary to do some tax reform and to shift our tax base probably towards property and away from income. There is a lot of discussion of that in the Treasury, and I think that's the way to go. It's not always popular with older people, but it's much easier to tax property and fairer given what's happened to prices. So that would be the shift I'd be looking at. In terms of public spending, it's very difficult to see where the economies are going to come from, because we've had some pretty brutal cuts over the last 10 years. I was party to some of them. And there are some parts of the budget that have been starved of resources. Local government, universal credit clearly needs improving. We need a lot more money pumped into education, particularly for the adult reviving schools. So we're going to have increased levels of spending rather than decreased, and that's where a modest increase in taxation directed primarily at assets, that's where I would be going. And I think they may indeed go there.
Olivia just sent me a message. You hadn't shown up, Olivia, as wanting to ask a question, but if you do have one question, we don't mind extending just a little. Olivia, do you have a question? Would appear not. Okay, so that's it. President David, can I hand back to you, please? Time has beaten us for your final comments.
Oh,
thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Olivia, go on, Olivia.
Sorry. Okay, can I talk? Yeah, or is it time's up?
Quickly.
Time's up,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, all right. I mean, I just want to ask Mr. Cable that since the coalition between the Tory and the Lib Dem in 2010, you see, many of the voters, you see, of the Lib Dem voters do not really know what the party stands for. And apart from its opposition, to Brexit, do you think that the Lib Dem party has missed an opportunity to become the party of the environment and education?
Well, good question. I think if I were trying to plan a long-term recovery, those are the two issues that I would probably focus on. It's not easy to recover. I mean, I was the leader of the party for a couple of years, and if you're a small party in Parliament, you get very little publicity. You're not called by the Speaker. It's difficult to get onto the BBC, so it's quite difficult to build up a national profile under those circumstances. So my suggestion is that our people concentrate on local government, which is what they have been doing, and they're getting back into a lot of councils, and hopefully they will go back to some of the big northern cities that they were running a few years ago, Hull, Liverpool, Newcastle, Sheffield, and others, and show people again that they're actually good at running things, which we are. And I think we showed in the government when we had a chance. But recovery is going to be difficult, partly because the Labour Party has now become more sensible. And a lot of people were frightened of voting for them in the Corbyn days, and that, I think, change. And so it's quite difficult to stake out ground which is very different from the Labour Party. But I think the two issues you've chosen, sort of massive investment in education and a real commitment to environment, probably working with the Green Party, which we have done, certainly in my borough. I encouraged the Dems and the Greens to work together. I think those two issues could very well be the ones which take us back.
Thank you. President David, back to you now.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to use your full title, if I may. The Right Honourable Dr. Sir Vincent Cable, for your talk. And it's a bit cumbersome, and it's not a title you use. And I was going to observe your humility as part of your essential character, and the fact that you actually are not considered particularly as a politician of the opposition. I have noted amongst my research that one of our senior members, Sir David Garrard, who is not known for his support of the Liberal Democrats, has supported some of your personal ventures. And that to me says a lot about you. And I'd like to thank you for your careful attention in particular. I mean, I'm not sure, I think you spoke for about 15 or 18 minutes, but you've answered questions for twice that. For your careful attention to our questions and to your considered answers. If I was to follow the approach taken by one of our members who often gives a vote of thanks, I could use the initials PPE in more than one context, because you considered the politics, you considered the people, and you considered the economy in answering the question of where does the UK go next. You've also considered the problems, you considered panic, and you've considered for example, in answer to the last question, the environment. In fact, you have covered so many different aspects of the questions that are facing the country at the moment. It's almost impossible to have expected a single answer. And a single answer would not have helped us in any case. But you've given us a very broad and perceptive view as to where we are going. We shall not panic. We should take it steadily. And I think you're saying we will get there. And I thank you very much for your contribution to the Rotary Club of London today. And my final action is to present you digitally with a speaker certificate. Now, you've probably got one already hanging on your wall somewhere. Maybe not. But you'll probably be receiving this through the digital media, but it has already taken a bit of a tree to produce the one I showed you. So I think I will leave it at that. So could we give our vote of thanks to the Right Honourable Dr. Sir Vince Cable in our normal manner. By all means, unmute before you do so. If you can unmute, do unmute. And then let us... I note that as we go beyond our bewitching hour, we have lost one or two members. So I won't extend the meeting any further, but no one need rush away as long as our Sergeant-at-Arms Clive is happy to keep our links open. So I really want to just announce our next week's speaker, who is actually on the screen at the moment, and is perhaps better known immediately as your Sergeant-at-Arms. But our Sergeant-at-Arms, past President Clive Amos, is going to be speaking to us next week under the chairmanship of past President Hugh Kirk, who is also on our screen at the moment. I have a week off. And so I will hand with pleasure over to Hugh, who will be introducing our speaker next week. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending today. And I will now, my final act is to ring our sonorous bell and declare the meeting closed.
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
They've done that already.
Oh, I'm sorry. My final toast. No, I can't go with the final toast.
Final toast again.
To Rotary and peace the world over. To Rotary and peace the world over. My apologies sincerely to members.